if we're talking about $880 million in lost funding for Chicago schools, with your background in Chicago schools, what does that mean? Does that mean more school closings?
It means more school closings. It means major teacher layoffs. It means huge class sizes. It means more school consolidations. It means an elimination of curriculum of supplemental educational services. It means at the high school level, a dismantling of vocational technical education, early college programs, school to work programs. I mean, that's what they'll do, because what school districts will do is they'll jettison anything that's not a core service. They'll jettison anything that is not a core educational service, and then they'll increase their class sizes. I mean, that's the approach that most districts take when they have draconian cuts, when they're facing draconian cuts.
Well, how many?
For that matter, even a more modest downturn.
How many schools would have to be closed to basically make
I
up for
don't
that?
know. I can't speculate, but if Chicago lost half of their funding, I mean, that 800. I don't know what their budget deficit is now. I mean, that would almost double their current structural balance. That would more than double their current structural balance. I don't know what I would suggest that so they would have no alternative but to shut things down or to dramatically increase class sizes. There was no alternative to that.
You are assuming here that it goes down to 3%, but Rauner has opened the door to not doing that right away. So there would be a difference in revenue the first year. You also have the new tax at $658 million. He claimed that was $1 billion in his plan. So they will clearly. There are potential for some other numbers besides.
Well, I don't know where the $1 billion is coming from. Okay. Well, we've documented the services. First of all, he's taxing 31 services, and we're using his numbers on the services. He's talked about closing a number of loopholes, all safe loopholes, incidentally, the loopholes that don't seem to impact his income categories, and we know what savings would be generated through that loophole closing. So the numbers that we're using are a combination of his specific proposals regarding closing corporate loopholes, many of which the governor has tried to do before and the legislature has wrestled with before, obviously with no success or with very limited success. And the service taxes are basically his number. They're not our number. So the point is, it's like $660 million. Once you take that out, you're left with a cut in the general funds of close to $8 billion.
Yeah, you still got you're assuming going immediately down to 3%. You said 3% over 4 years.
Well, look, right away. My point is, I didn't say that this was going to impact us immediately. I said once the plan is fully implemented. He incidentally didn't say that he's not going to go down to 3%. He said he's going to get down to 3%. Let me point out that the bulk of the reduction occurs in the first year or two. So you might lose $5 billion over the next 2 years, and then ultimately, if you phased it out over 4 years, you get down to $8 billion. The bottom line is, Chicago's going to see a decrease in their state funding by $880 million, unless you do some draconian things to the departments and agencies and things like that. That's Chicago. The state's going to see a reduction in funding available for schools by $4 billion. Whether that's in a single year or whether that's over a 2 to 3 year period, it's still devastating. Because at a time when we need to be investing in education, we're going to be disinvesting, so to speak. So whether it happens over 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years, then it's still going to have a dramatic impact. A $1 billion cut to education would have a significant impact. Early on, we projected what a $1 billion increase would, or a decrease in funding for education would have across the board, specifically the number we put out in Chicago would just be devastating.
Is this chart an annual figure, though, for annual?
It's an annualized figure. Once this plan is fully implemented, that's going to be the impact. And once again, because of the timing of the rate reductions and things like that, the bulk of the cuts really occurred during the first 2 years. Once they're annualized, I think most of the cuts occurred during the first 2 years. So whether you're losing this, whether education is losing $2 billion in the first year and then another billion in the second year, another billion in the third year, the bottom line is, over that period of time, that's the reduction you're going to see, and that can have a draconian impact. Look, you know, he's presented a budget that simply doesn't work and that simply isn't responsible, and he's trying to sell it as a comprehensive solution to what ails Illinois. You know, I mean, disinvesting in education does not improve the business climate. It does not create jobs. You know, it's not investing in our children's future. It's as simple as that. So, you know, we can't let him get off the hook. This is his plan. This is the plan we've been waiting for. Schools are opening. Schools are opening, and it's an opportune time for us to revisit what he's proposed and to continue to ask the fundamental question: how are you going to close the gap? How are you going to make up the difference? How are you going to avoid these draconian cuts? You know, I mean, that's a question that should be asked every day on this campaign.
On the other side of this, you talk about school districts would have to raise property taxes, but he also wants, and I guess it would be the legislature, to freeze property taxes without referendum. So again, he's probably putting you in a box by saying, well, you don't want that, or do you want that? Because and is that realistic? And will the legislature do it? Do you want the legislature to do it? And then politically, he's on the taxpayer side, isn't he?
Yeah, well, you know, look, it's clearly, I mean, if he really believes this stuff, it's either this is what he really believes, or this is part of a carefully constructed campaign to try to, like, appeal to everybody. I'm gonna cut your taxes, but I'm gonna freeze your property taxes. Then I'm gonna increase funding for education. Bernie, we've been around a long time. You've been through a lot of gubernatorial races, and we've had governors who maybe have been more optimistic before the election and suddenly pessimistic after the election. But we've had governors who have said, no, we don't need to raise taxes, and then after the election have proposed tax increases. Of course, you know, I worked for somebody John Clark Netsch, who was, always specific about what her intentions were, regardless of whether it was pre-election or post-election. But here we have a guy who basically has laid out a plan to cut general funds by $8 billion. And then, when we suddenly said, well, wouldn't that increase property taxes dramatically? Because that's been the law of gravity. That's the law of financial gravity in Illinois. You significantly reduce funding to local governments. Local government taxes and fees and borrowing dramatically rises. It always happens. It always happens. So what is he doing? Just puts out a whole new batch of commercials saying, we're going to freeze property taxes, knowing full well that he's got to have the legislature doing that. So he's going to go to the legislature and he's going to say, I want to cut and decimate school funding to the tune of $8 billion. Totally destroy the financial stability of many poor districts and many mid-sized, medium-income districts across the state. Obviously having a devastating impact on the city of Chicago, but I'm going to freeze property taxes. You know, I mean, that's the solution. His solution is just to run ads saying he's going to freeze property taxes. But I'm going to increase funding for education. You know, I mean... Are you saying he can't get the legislature to do that? Well, you know, what I'm saying is it's a... I can't speak for the legislature. The bottom line is this. You're not going to dramatically slash funding. You're not going to decimate local education budgets and then not have local education budgets do one of two things. Either continue to increase their property taxes, raise their property taxes, or totally decimate educational services. So two things are going to happen, and I think it's going to be a combination of things. Either property taxes are going to go up, or thousands, tens of thousands of teachers are going to be laid off. Okay, I think it's going to be a combination of both. I think it's going to be a combination of both. You can't come in and slash funding for local governments by $8 billion and then not expect local governments to try to compensate. But at the end of the day, and again, you know, let's assume that they, you know, the reason that we put out a 27,700 teacher estimate on the number of teaching positions that could be jeopardized, the reason we put out that number was because we assumed that other things would be done to perhaps offset half the cuts that would be forced on school districts across the state. And that's the reason we came up with that conservative estimate.
If they don't make up that money, 54,000 teachers later?
Oh, you know, you know, let's just say that we're pretty comfortable with the 27,000 number. But it is what it is. The numbers are what they are. Last question.
We're in a union building, and there's been a lot of talk from unions in your campaign about Scott Walker lately. Is he somebody you want to help use to fire up teachers to go and vote, given that, you know, some of them have been upset with the governor over pensions and other?
You know what, this kind of, this is what it is. I mean, the bottom line is, we don't need to fire people up. This is reality. This is reality. This isn't us coming up with a fictitious number. This is us talking about his plan. This is about us laying out his plan in great specificity. This is what he'll do. These are the consequences. These are the financial consequences. These are real solid numbers. You know, when we go out there and we critique elements of his plan, his proposals, we always deal with the facts. We always deal with the real numbers. I mean, his budget will reduce general funds discretionary spending by $8 billion. That's a fact. That's not an interpretation. It's not an estimate. That's a fact. That will happen. And half that discretionary funding that will be impacted will be education. Those are facts. So, are we doing it to fire up the base? We're doing it to let people know that there's a contrast between candidates. The governor, prior to the election, laid out a plan, a 5-year balanced budget plan, that would have, among other things, invested $6 billion for education, universal cradle to the classroom, universal job training, with great specificity. Here's the contrast. We've got a guy who wants to reduce the general fund's discretionary spending by $8 billion, $4 billion of which would have to be taken from education, unless some other more draconian cuts were imposed on other discretionary services. So it is what it is. I don't have to explain his budget. I just have to outline what the facts are. It's up to him to explain how he's going to address the long-term needs of the state for investing in education, for providing relief for local property taxpayers, and make the numbers add up. These numbers don't add up.